Coming up on Arirang News, the South Korean government and ruling party have agreed on a budget proposal for next year of around 605 trillion won, well over $500 billion. That's the biggest on record, much of it set aside for fighting the pandemic. The South Korean health authorities are looking at a potential surge in coronavirus cases because of the Delta variant. The vaccine campaign is speeding up, though. Some may be able to get their first dose sooner than planned. And in the United States, the Pfizer vaccine becomes the first to get full approval from the FDA. That makes vaccine mandates more likely. Until now, it had only emergency approval. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. South Korea's ruling party and the government have agreed on a budget proposal for next year of 605 trillion won. At well over $500 billion, that's a record high. It's only a slight increase from this year's spending if you include all the money in the supplementary budgets. Next year's plan includes more money for addressing the pandemic, including its economic damage and the cost of vaccines. Min Soo-kyun reports.
The ruling Democratic Party and the government have agreed for next year's budget to be slightly higher than the budget this year. The party floor leader Yoon Ho-jung said in a meeting at the National Assembly on Tuesday that the country needed to secure sufficient funds for vaccine procurement and COVID-19 response measures. The budget for this year was around $520 billion, but Yoon stressed that a bigger budget is necessary to overcome the pandemic-induced crisis. Yoon added that they agreed to spend around $850 million to support small businesses and the self-employed. However, he said that the compensation budget did not take into account all variables, such as the spread of new COVID-19 variants. The Democratic Party also called on the government to have more confidence in its expansive fiscal policy and to take an inclusive approach to economic recovery. Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi said that the government is maintaining its fiscal expansion in next year's budget to provide support for the country's economic recovery in all sectors. For next year, the government and the ruling party plan to set aside around $2 billion for climate change and $18 billion to support young adults, such as through interest-free loans for monthly rent for those with an annual income of less than 50 million won or $43,000. The budget plan for 2022 will go through a cabinet meeting next week before being submitted to the National Assembly on September 3rd. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
South Korea's consumer sentiment is down for August, the second monthly decline in a row, but it's still above 100, so consumers are broadly optimistic. Data from the Bank of Korea show the composite consumer sentiment index hit 102.5, down 0.7 of a point from the month before. The central bank attributed the decline to the pandemic's fourth wave. The BOK, though, says the fact that it's above 100 for 6 months in a row indicates that people do feel okay about the economy. South Korea's presidential office will be holding an event this Thursday reviewing the accomplishments of the country's so-called second venture boom in small business and looking ahead at the future. President Moon Jae-in is expected to deliver a message at the event held online, encouraging active support for startups and outlining the government's plan to make Korea a global venture powerhouse. The Blue House says more Korean startups are succeeding in expanding to markets overseas and are thereby showing their growing capacity to create jobs and attract investment. The Minister of SMEs, Kwon Chil-sung, will brief the president on the progress of startups and the second venture boom. Also taking part in the event will be around 70 people, including venture investors, the heads of unicorn companies, and other entrepreneurs. South Korea's biggest conglomerate, Samsung Group, has announced a plan to invest a total of some $206 billion over the next 3 years to grow its semiconductor and bio businesses. In a statement Tuesday, the company said about 3/4 of the amount will be invested domestically, and it pledged to hire 40,000 more employees through 2023. The announcement came 11 days after Samsung Group's de facto leader Lee Jae-yong was let out of prison on parole, which many expected would speed up decision-making. It's also the largest single investment ever announced by a Korean conglomerate. Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for making time today.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks on Wall Street overnight had a nice bounce back from last week's losses. Of course, we're coming up on the Fed's annual retreat, normally held at Jackson Hole, so we should get some more clues about plans for tapering. The S&P and the Nasdaq at new all-time highs. What's the story in the global markets?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it seems to show very strong movement since last Friday. It continued to rise as of Monday. If you look at Dow Jones, jumped by 0.6%, hitting well above 35,000 level. And S&P 500 also went up by 0.9%, fresh high of 4,479. And particularly the Nasdaq, it climbed by 1.6%, almost hitting 15,000 territories, ending at around 14,943. Clearly, the growth stocks led Nasdaq seems to show very strong movement at the current point in time, as most of people are saying that the uncertainty regarding the overall tapering seems to be easing. If you look at the Fed releases coming, if you look at the Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan said on Friday, he's been quite hawkish, but now he's reconsidering his hawkish stance as if the virus harms the economy. Investors are looking at less confident Fed Chair Powell talking at the Jackson Hole meeting this week, indicating that the timeline for overall reducing the central bank's bond buying program. And if you look at the speed of such, with the mentioning from the minute to the actual reduction of the purchasing program, it might not happen until the end of this year or beginning of next year. If that's the case, then U.S. market have more room for further rise, as we have seen such movement in 2013 May, when they first talked about it, and actually the implementation happening in December of 2013. And during that period of time, U.S. market continued to rally after the short correction. Now, if you look at the overall other countries, it seems that with the U.S. market rising and furthermore dollar stabilizing rather than continue to be appreciating, that means that further liquidity is available for the other emerging market or other market. And clearly the Asian market, who suffered the most, has recovered. And most of the other countries are all showing a rising trend. Furthermore, if you look at the futures market, it seems that the U.S. market would to continue to rise towards the end of this day as well, given the fact that the liquidity is quite ample.
And the Korean markets today, it seems, taking their cue from Wall Street. The Kospi and the Kosdaq both up by a large margin. Foreign investors this week have returned to buying, and you did mention the dollar, and we have seen the exchange rate come down here in Korea. Tell us about the domestic market.
Yes, Kospi was up by 1.56%, and Kosdaq was up 2%. As you know, the Korean market has been suffering quite significantly in the last 2 months or so. From its peak to bottom, it corrected by more than 8%. This kind of correction was happening because of the foreign investors continue to be a net seller of the market, with the currency moving towards the very high level of as high as 1170, late 70 or 80 territories. With this kind of the movement, continuous uncertainty was actually happening. On top of that, as you know, the BOK were talking about possibility of rate hike before the end of this year, given the fact that the uncertainty lies with the consumer debt. And also there were quite a lot of measures coming through where the domestic commercial banks were actually not lending or increasing the consumer debt size. So all that has resulted into a weakness and uncertainty of the Korean market. But with the U.S. currency stabilizing, Korean won also seems to be stabilizing as well. With this, foreign investors, they're not major net buyers back, but nevertheless, they're no longer seller of the market. And with the liquidity condition being ample in domestic market, with the rate hike might not be happening anytime close, near soon, we saw Korean market recovering quite nicely. Most of the growth stocks were doing well. And even for the semiconductor sector, which is the largest market cap of Korea, showing quite nice recovery with Samsung Electronics rising by more than 3% today. And most of the other semiconductor equipment stocks were up well above that 3% territories.
And to zero in on a couple of particular companies for a minute, in the first half of this year, Samsung Electronics and LG Electronics had a global market share in the TV sector of right at 50%. That's pretty impressive. And both saw major improvements from a year earlier. Tell us about Korea, if you will, and the TV market.
Yes, we must say that Korea's overall market capitalization indicates that Korea's strongest sector, obviously, is the IT segment, including the TV area. The consumer electronics were the part of where Korea having very strong market share, both in the TV market as well as the various other consumer equipment. Now, LG Electronics and Samsung Electronics showed they have basically continued to show more than 50% market share, two company combined, and maintain their leadership in the premium segment. Samsung accounted for 31% of the global TV market in terms of sales revenue, and also LG followed by 19%. Adding these two up, it was above 50%. Also, thereafter, if you look at the other countries' major companies, Japan's Sony came in at about 9.3% in market share, and other company with a 7.3% Sensei. By the volume, Samsung made 21.2% of the global market share. And if you look at that, it continued to be topping 20 million plus units since 2016. That's quite of a result that we have seen. And also LG is continued to be selling quite significant amount. LG sold 13.56 million TVs in the first half. It's rising by 25.8% from a year earlier. So clearly, increased supply and enhanced price competitiveness of the OLED display is making LG continue to be gaining its market share. So all in all, TV market and other consumer electronics market, Korean companies are continue to remain at one of the highest market share players. And if so, then we think that with this fourth industrial revolution happening in a global scale, we think that Korea's electronic sector or the IT sector would continue to remain at one of the top players, and therefore we expect that share price movement should be in a right track to rise further.
And finally, Mr. Yu, in cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin's seen an improvement in the past week. The price above $50,000 as recently as last night for the first time in a few months, retreating a bit now. But what do you see driving this recovery?
Right. As you said, Bitcoin has finally surged above 50,000 mark as the virtual currency continues to climb up out of the month-long slump that we saw in the earlier month. Now it is first time Bitcoin has reached above that 50,000 mark since the May 15th of this year. Ethereum was up more than 3%. Dogecoin also rose by about 2%. This kind of continued movement is obviously the cryptocurrency is becoming one of the alternative assets for investors to invest. And a lot of the asset management companies as well as other financial institutions are considering cryptocurrency as a part of asset they need to invest. And announcements are all coming from the various other countries where they're considering the Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency as a part of the purchasing element or purchasing size, purchasing factors. So with this, obviously most of the people are looking at Bitcoin as the alternative asset. And if you look at the overall money supply growth that you are seeing in a global scale, we think that currency are depreciating in terms of the value itself as far as the cash is concerned. And that leads into the cryptocurrency or alternative assets value to rise further. All in all, from beginning of this year to the right now, we did see the cryptocurrency rising quite rapidly. But as for other alternative assets, gold and silver really didn't do too well. So more and more people are focusing on this cryptocurrency segment rather than other alternative asset as a currency or alternative currency to play. And we think that that kind of trend would continue with what we are seeing in the fourth industrial revolution so far.
All right, Mr. Yu, we'll leave it there for today and catch up with you again later this week to see where the markets are then. Thank you as always for coming on. We appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.
South Korea's unification minister Lee In-young met this morning with America's top nuclear negotiator Sung Kim to discuss issues related to the Korean Peninsula. According to the unification ministry, the two exchanged their overall views of the situation, including North Korea's recent attitude. Lee and Kim also discussed ways to advance the allies' common goals, such as the sustainable development of inter-Korean relations and the resumption of dialogue between the two Koreas and between the North and the U.S. Also in Seoul, South Korea's chief nuclear envoy No Kyu-duk met with his counterpart from Russia, Igor Morgulov. According to the foreign ministry, they discussed ways to achieve complete denuclearization and lasting peace on the Korean peninsula. No asked for Moscow's support in bringing Pyongyang back to the negotiating table. Morgulov agreed that it's important to resume dialogue with the North and said Russia will contribute to achieving peace. He also invited No to Russia for further discussions. This was the first meeting between these two officials, coming more than 2.5 years since the Russian envoy last came to Seoul. South Korea and China today, marking 29 years of diplomatic ties, launched a bilateral committee on future development to move their relations forward in the years to come. In cooperation with experts in a variety of fields, including economy, and politics, the committee will work on establishing a roadmap for future Seoul-Beijing ties. Through video messages at Tuesday's launching ceremony, South Korea's Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi stressed the importance of fostering bilateral cooperation as close neighbors. The committee will focus on bolstering ties in a range of sectors, including politics and diplomacy, economy and trade, as well as society and culture. South Korea has been at the highest level of social distancing for 6 weeks now, but case numbers are still high. Today, coronavirus cases at more than 1,500. But on the bright side, an increase in vaccine supplies could enable some people to get their first doses sooner than planned. Ji-young has more.
The fourth wave of the pandemic is not showing any signs of slowing as the daily new coronavirus cases bounced back above 1,500 mark. The country reported 1,509 cases on Tuesday, up 91 from the previous day's figure. Of them, 1,470 were local infections, with 65% of them from the capital area. 39 cases were from overseas. Health authorities say there could be a further surge in infections due to the highly contagious Delta variant. The number of Delta variant infections in the last 7 days in South Korea amounted to 3,033, taking up some 99% of infections from the 4 major variants. Authorities said the Delta variant spreads much more than the original COVID-19 virus.
Currently, the Delta variant emits up to 300 times more virus on the very first day of the infection than the non-variant strain that was prevalent during the first wave of pandemic.
In order to curb the spread of the Delta variant, health authorities urge people to get vaccinated. Inoculation for those aged 18 to 49 starts on Friday. The authorities said some people who have reserved their shots for after the Chuseok holiday will be able to move up their appointments as more doses of Moderna vaccines are supplied. The government said they'll stabilize the fourth wave and that students going back to school to take in-person classes is needed for society. Meanwhile, another 1.59 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine purchased directly from the company will arrive at Incheon International Airport on Wednesday. 엄지영, Arirang News.
In the United States, the FDA has granted full approval to the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Pfizer and its partner BioNTech. Until now, the Pfizer vaccine had been given only emergency authorization. Many expect this will lead more American companies to start requiring vaccination, something that's already happening in the public sector. Kim Hyo-sun has more.
The U.S. FDA has formally approved Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, replacing the emergency use authorization granted by the agency last December. The decision is expected to boost the vaccination rate across the U.S., where around 52% of the population have been fully vaccinated. With the approval, the vaccine also got the brand name Comirnaty. The FDA reassured the American public that the full approval means the vaccine meets high standards for safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing quality. It added the milestone puts the U.S. one step closer to altering the course of the pandemic. The full approval applies to people 16 and older, with children aged 12 through 15 still eligible to get the shot under emergency use authorization. President Biden hailed the move on Monday, urging unvaccinated people to get their inoculations now.
The FDA approval is the gold standard. And as I just said, now it has been granted. Those who have been waiting for full approval should go get your shot now. The vaccination is free, it's easy, it's safe, and it's effective, and it's convenient.
He also encouraged American businesses to step up vaccine requirements for their employees. President Biden also stressed that the Delta variant is causing a pandemic of the unvaccinated, with nearly all COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths being reported among those who are not inoculated. Against this backdrop, all New York City public school teachers and other staffers will be mandated to receive their shots as the city ramps up protections before the beginning of the new school year next month. Under the city's first no-option vaccination mandate, some 148,000 school employees will be required to get at least one dose by September 27th. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
In other news, South Korea is reviewing the possibility of giving special extended stay permits to Afghan nationals in South Korea so they don't have to return right away to potential danger in their home country. Speaking on Tuesday, Justice Minister Park Bom-gye said some of the rules that allowed extensions of stay during the Myanmar crisis could be applied to South Korea's Afghan community, believed to number around 400 people. In March, Myanmar nationals were given permission to stay here until Myanmar regains stability, regardless of the expiration date on their stay permits. Minister Park said the government is also preparing to bring Afghans who worked closely with South Korea in Afghanistan to South Korea to protect them. The Paralympic Games kick off tonight in Tokyo, and if you're tuning in for the opening ceremony, the South Korean delegation will be the 81st country to enter. They had before been told they'd be 92nd, but the Paralympic Committee amended that on Monday. South Korea's delegation for the ceremony will be small because of the record-high number of coronavirus cases in Tokyo, but it will include team leader Ju Won-hong. The first team to enter will be the Paralympic team representing refugees. The southern part of South Korea last night endured a direct hit from a typhoon that made landfall over the southern coast and exited over the eastern coast. And it brought intense and sudden rainstorms, causing property damage and prompting thousands of people to evacuate their homes. Choi Min-jung reports.
Typhoon Omaes has left the South Korean Peninsula after pounding southern parts of the country with heavy rain overnight. More than 200 millimeters of rainfall flooded houses, local markets, and roads. Some parts of Gyeongsang-namdo province saw almost 100 millimeters an hour of rain. The southern port city of Busan also got hit by up to 88 millimeters an hour at around midnight Tuesday. Fortunately, no injuries have been reported, but one river overflowed, forcing around 30 nearby residents to evacuate. Some people also had to be rescued after being trapped in submerged vehicles. Landslide warnings and advisories were issued, and cars were turned away from bridges due to strong winds. More than 110 damage reports have been filed in Busan. Meanwhile, in Jeollanam-do province, around 12,000 residents living in areas at risk of landslides were evacuated. And more than 240 residents were evacuated to nearby community centers in Changwon, Gyeongsang-namdo province. Although all typhoon warnings have now been lifted, heavy rain continues to fall along the eastern and southern coasts. A strong wind advisory and a heavy rain advisory have been issued for parts of Jeju Island. Many regions in the south are also under a heavy rain watch. Authorities are advising people be extra careful of potential accidents as the ground has weakened due to the heavy rain. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.